Well, hello everybody. I hope everything's going well. You know, I've been a fan of macro photography for some time. I took some of my first images maybe about 35, 36 years ago. At the time, I started out using just some basic close-up lenses, which would attach to my 50mm kit lens. They came with my first Nikon that I bought. Fortunately, since then, I've been able to purchase better equipment. And recently, I purchased the Tokina 100mm 2.8 macro lens. And, well, since the weather hasn't been that good this particular weekend, it's been very rainy, I decided to do a little indoor macro photography work. I went out to a local store and I actually purchased a variety of flowers. And I set those up in a little makeshift studio that I have here in my home. And I took quite a few images and chose some of the best ones and did the appropriate processing on them. And right now I'd like to share those images with you and walk you through some of the steps that I did to create these images. Okay, so let's get to it.
Okay. All right, here is the first image. And with this particular image, first of all, let me say this. With the exception of one image, everything was shot at a very high ISO. I shot these at ISO 2000. Now, generally, you don't want to use something that high, but every shot that I made was handheld. So a high ISO was actually necessary to get the sharpest possible image. Okay. All right, this particular image was shot with the Tokina 100mm 2.8 macro lens, f-stop 10 1/80th of a second. All right, the processing was done in a combination of Lightroom, Topaz Studio 2. I also added a film stock look to this in DxO film pack, and I did that with a number of the images that you're going to see. And the final processing was actually done in Photoshop to add just a little bit more texture to it and a little bit more contrast. All right. Okay, this next image was shot once again with the 100mm 2.8 Tokina, and this shot was actually at 100mm, so we're getting a true life-sized image here. And I particularly like this. The main light was just to the left of the camera, I'm sorry, of the subject itself. And this was also processed, the initial processing was done in Lightroom. And I really did very little to this image, except add some sharpening to it. And just a little bit of contrast. This image I pretty much could have used this almost right out of the camera. Very little was done to it. Okay, and the settings on this were f-stop 11 and 1/60th of a second. And by the way, the main light source is actually a 6500K LED bulb, LED light, which is to the right of the subject. And I particularly like the look of that particular light source. Okay, this next image, I did something a little bit different here. What I did was I held an LED light behind the flower itself to illuminate it, and took the exposure. I took probably 3 or 4 shots, and this was the one that I liked the best. And the processing was done in the initial processing, of course, was done in Lightroom. I put this also in Topaz Studio 2 to give it a smoother, more diffuse look to it. And I also ran this through DxO film pack as well. And I used the Fuji Pro F100 film stock profile on this. And of course the finishing touches were done in Photoshop. I added a little bit of sharpening to it, and I added a bit of a Gaussian blur to this. Actually, the Orton effect is what I actually used, and I thought this came out quite well. Okay. Okay, now this next image was actually the very first one that I shot. What I did was I used a macro ring flash on this particular image. And of course, this is a life-sized image. This was shot at 100 millimeters. And it was at the sync speed of 1/60th of a second. And if you look at the overall look of the image, it has a considerably different look than the previous three that we've just looked at. The ring flash, I personally preferred the illumination that came from the 6400K LED light. The ring flash actually did a very good job, but my personal preference is the look of the LED bulb, and but I like this as well. And of course, I ran this through Topaz Studio as well, and I smoothed out the appearance of the leaves, and I used a layer mask in the center to get rid of that diffused look as much as possible in the center, while accentuating the outer leaves. And I thought this came out quite well. Okay, and the settings on this were ISO 2000 again, at 100 millimeters, f-stop 11, 1/60th of a second. Okay, this next image was also shot at life-size magnification at 100 millimeters. And this was one of the images that I did not that much to. I also ran this through Topaz Studio 2 to give a more smoother, more diffuse look to the leaves that are branching out from the center. And I took this into Photoshop for the final steps and added a little bit of sharpening, and I increased the luminosity of the center of the image to draw your eye directly into that. Even at ISO 2000, it's showing a very good detail, and it's not too grainy at all. And of course, the settings on this were f-stop 11 at 1/60th of a second, and as I said, all of these shots were actually handheld. All right. Now, this next image is actually my favorite of the bunch. This was as you can see, this was a flower where the bud was just beginning to try and open up just a little bit. And I was struggling with trying to find the right angle to shoot this from. I actually took about 4 or 5 shots of this particular flower from different angles, and this is the one that appealed to me out of the 5. If you notice, there's a water droplet right on top of it, and you can actually see the reflection from the light source in the water droplet. I wrestled with whether or not to leave that reflection in the water or on the water drop or remove it. I noticed that once I removed it, it seemed to take something away from the image, so I elected to keep it, and I'm glad that I did. Okay, the post-processing for this was also done in Topaz Studio. I added a very slight impressionistic filter to it to smooth it out a bit, and I also took this into DxO Film Pack, and I once again added one of the Fuji film stock looks to this. And then finally in Photoshop, I cooled down the image a little bit, and I rather like this. This is actually my favorite of the group. Okay. All right, this next image is also one of my favorites. I rather enjoy this one. This was one of those images that the only thing that I did to this, essentially, apart from the initial processing in Lightroom, was to take it into DxO Film Pack. And I used one of the, I believe I used the Fuji Velvia film stock on this to give it this particular look. And of course, the attention is drawn right to the center of the image. And I enhanced the color somewhat, increased the saturation, and I rather like this one as well. If you look in the background, it has some very nice bokeh in the background. I did actually use just a little bit of noise reduction on this because in certain areas the grain was rather prevalent on this particular shot. So I did use a little bit of noise reduction, and that really worked out well. And let's see the settings on this. F-stop 10, 1/60th of a second, like pretty much all of them. And of course, this is still at ISO 2000. All right, now this last image was actually taken of the same flower in the very first image that I showed. The only difference was I shot probably only about 1/3 of the flower. And as you can see, there are 6 leaves which are branching out from it. And because of the water droplets that are on it, I really wanted to accentuate the water that was on these leaves. What I did was I took this into DxO film pack, and I added, once again, I believe it was the Fuji Pro F100 film stock profile to it. And I increased the saturation just a bit. I was kind of wrestling with what to do with this, because if I were showing the entire flower, you do have that contrast in colors because the center of the flower is green. But simply with this, I needed some variations in shades, variations in color, and I got that by using the Fuji film stock on this. I increased the contrast. I beefed up the sharpness a bit on this. And just to add a little something, oh, and by the way, the background, as you see, is completely black. This isn't because I used a macro flash. I actually removed the background and turned it completely black because I wanted to accentuate just the leaves on the flower itself and the water droplets. And I decided to just give the effect that maybe this was taken at night. So what I did was I took a portion of one of the leaves and inserted it in the upper right-hand corner and made a circle, somewhat of a semicircle out of it, to kind of mimic the moon. Just a little something I thought I would throw in. Well, that's pretty much it for these images. Hopefully you enjoyed them, and I definitely will be doing a little bit more macro work in the future. This was a lot of fun. I was pretty much doing this most of the afternoon on Saturday, and I'm pretty pleased with what I got, and I learned quite a bit from it. So I should be able to make some significant improvements on my next outing. So, as always, if you've enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to comment, like, and please subscribe. Okay? Until next time.